Good morning, and welcome to the FUBiS Digital Lecture Series 2020. My name is Stefano de Bosio. I'm an art historian, and I'm very happy to be here with you today, although not in person in Berlin, in order to tell you something more about my course for FUBiS on the history of European art. To begin with, please let me briefly introduce myself. I've been teaching at FUBiS since 2017, while having also other research position in institutions in Europe and abroad. My field of expertise is early modern European art, that is to say, art produced between the 15th and the 18th century. Among my research interests is what is called the artist mobility, that is to say, how the travel of artists, but also of artworks, shaped the history of European art. And as you will see, this is a topic that is also at the center of my course for FUBiS. A course that is called History of European Art, Local Traditions and Transnational Networks. For those of you who want to know more about the FUBiS program, you can visit the FUBiS internet site at www.fubis.org. So let's start have a look to the contents and learning objectives of my course for FUBiS. So as you can see, this course explores European art from the 15th to the 20th centuries, with a particular focus on the travels of artists and artworks between urban centers like Florence, Rome, Venice, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Paris, London, and of course, Berlin. The aim is to analyze how mobility contributed through the centuries to shape local identities as well as European visual cultural traditions and style common to different countries. During our lessons, we will analyze the artworks and the authors in relation to the different historical contexts and the places of their creation. Recurrent will be the focus on the complex interplay between artists and patrons, between local traditions, individual creativity, and the broader social, political, and cultural contexts in which artworks and buildings were produced. While designing this course, we had in mind also people with no specific background in art history. This is why, attending this course, students will gain an understanding of the main art movements and the relevant artists from the Renaissance to the post-war period, and the special role played by travels in giving shape to a European cultural space. Among the more distinctive aspects of my course of History of European Art is that every week, and sometimes also twice a week, we will visit one of the wonderful Berlin museums. So we will visit the Bode Museum, the Gemälde Gallery, the Neue Nationalgalerie, the Berggruen Museum, and the Hamburger Bahnhof. And in each of these institutions, we will spend time looking at the real works of art that we will have analyzed before in our classes. One of the most interesting things is also that will be not only me as a lecturer presenting you the artworks in the museums, but will be also you giving a presentation to your colleagues while being in the museum. I think that this is an excellent exercise in order to familiarize with the specific lexicon and the particular, let's say, rules in describing artworks that is characteristic of the art historical discipline. And I have to say that In the past year, the discussion that emerged from this presentation, but also the discussion that we had during daily classes, it was absolutely one of the most interesting aspects of my seminars. And this is, of course, also due to the fact that at FUBiS come together people from all around the world and with very different background. And I think that art history is one of those disciplines where each of these backgrounds can bring something to the understanding of the works of art. And then is it exactly to stress this very peculiar nature of the work of art that I would like to start my lecture with this quotation from Fred Kleiner, an archaeologist and art historian at the Boston University. I quote from Kleiner: "People cannot see or touch history's vanished human events, but a visible, tangible artwork is a kind of persisting event. One or more artists made it at a certain time and in a specific place. Although created in the past, an artwork continues to exist in the present, long surviving its times." End of quote. I would say that this is one of those aspects that you have always to keep in mind while studying art history. We study objects and people from the past, but we study them from the today perspective, trying to also use them in order to understand things and dynamics that are relevant for the present and for the future. And this is why also my course stresses in such a way the creation of a new European cultural network during the centuries. This is something that is very relevant today in a time when the different European nations are trying to come together in the European Union. My course in this sense is a kind of history of how art circulated through the different European countries and how the different places in Europe also entered in contact one with each other and created also different cultural tradition that also, let's say, entered in a dialogue one with another. So to give you an idea of the topics that will be addressed in my classes, I chose today to speak about three objects. This is something that is very typical of art historians, to choose single objects from which you can open broader questions and you can understand broader cultural and aesthetic context. And the objects that I will consider today come from the Flemish art of the 15th century. So the Flanders in the 15th century is an area that corresponds to today Belgium and Netherlands. And during the 15th century, the Flanders were one of the richest area in Europe, an area that gave birth to one of the most fascinating artistic production in 15th century Europe. This area was part of the called Duchy of Burgundy, state that ceased to exist at the end of the 15th century. And as you can see, it was placed between the Kingdom of France and the territories that were part of the German Empire. What is typical of the Duchy of Burgundy is that, of course, was characterized by very lively aristocratic court, the court of the Duke of Burgundy, and lots of the most important Netherlandish artists worked for the Duke of Burgundy. But at the same time, the Flanders were the place of a number of striving cities like Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp, Brussels. And in these cities, the patrons were mainly merchants. So people who did not belong to the aristocracy. And Netherlandish art of the 15th century somehow find its specificity in this coexistence of an aristocratic and let's say civic art. But let's move to the first object. And in order to do that, we virtually enter one of the most important museums in Berlin, the Gemäldegalerie, an institution that owns an impressive collection of painting, in particular, from the Middle Age to the 18th century. And let's stop in front of this painting by Jan van Eyck. Jan van Eyck has been one of the most important artists of the 15th century Netherlandish art. And here in this small painting, as you can see, is only 12 per 5.5 inch width and high. In this small painting, I was saying, we understand the historical importance of Jan van Eyck as an artist. But let's start having a closer look to the subject of this painting. As you can see, the Virgin Mary is represented here with this small Christ, the young Christ in his hand. So it's a Madonna and Child hosted in a church. If we come closer, we see that the work shows Mary wearing a dark blue robe, a color that is traditionally used to emphasize her humanity. On her head is an elaborately tied and jeweled crown, and in her arms she carries the infant Jesus, his feet resting on her left hand. Jesus' hand clutches in the jeweled neckline of his mother's dress. If we look closer, we see that this is not the only subject connected with the relation to the history, to the life of the Virgin in this painting. On the back, actually, here you can see two bas-reliefs representing the Annunciation and the birth of Christ. And here in a niche in this church, there is also a statue of the Virgin and the Child lit by two candles. Jan van Eyck created a masterpiece in this work also by modulating in a masterful way the different source of light that illuminate the interior of this cathedral. You can see here the light filtering from the stained glass window, and we see the beams of lights reflecting on the pavement of the church, entering from this liminal space on the left of the painting. Well, This incredible detailed description of the figure of the Virgin Mary with the child, of the interior of this church, of the different sources of light, was made possible by one of the greatest, let's say, technical discoveries of 15th century Netherlandish art. And this is, of course, oil painting. So it was oil painting, the use of oil painting, that allowed these superbly naturalistic effects of light and color. And you have to understand that this new technique allowed it for the first time to superimpose translucent glazes, this is to say transparent layers over different opaque and semi-opaque underlayers. And this created richer colors than possible using other techniques like tempera or frescoes. And the oil painting allowed the shimmering splendor of colors that is typical of Van Eyck paintings and of this small painting also that we have in front of us. This meticulous attention to recording the exact surface appearance of people and object. This meticulous attention is probably one of the hallmarks of Flemish panel painting in the 15th century. At the same time, it's very important to consider that this naturalistic attitude is associated here also with a strong symbolic meaning. If we look carefully, we see that the size of this Madonna and Child is absolutely giant. You see, this figure is almost high as the clerestory in the cathedral. Actually, here the Virgin and Child is also a metaphor for the Church, for the power of the Catholic Church. So in this painting, Van Eyck subtly suggests that the Virgin is the emblem of the triumphing Church. And all of this, as I told you, is done in a very small painting. Here is how this painting appears in the Gemälde Galerie. And you have to imagine that this painting was made for a diptych, that is to say, for a small altarpiece that was easy to be brought with you while traveling. Unfortunately, we don't know what was the subject or the other half of the diptych painted by Van Eyck, but we know copies like this one from later in the 15th century, this one by the master of the 1499, an anonymous master, that shows that probably, like often in this kind of objects from the 15th century, the other half of the diptych showed the patron kneeling in prayer in front of the Virgin Mary. I wanted to start my lecture with this object because I think it's always important to think about how the objects that we see today under a glass window in a museum were originally much more complex in their use and in their, let's say, manipulation. You have to imagine that this diptych could be closed and brought with you, as I was telling you, while traveling, but also you could come closer to it in order to look at all the details that Van Eyck painted in it. And I would say that size and the portability of objects is a very, very fascinating aspect in the history of European art, an aspect that also explains how some styles could spread easily all around Europe, thanks to the portability of objects like this one. At the very same time, of course, Van Eyck painted also very, very big artworks. And this, on the screen, is probably his most famous masterpiece, the so-called Ghent Altarpiece. The name comes from the place where the altarpiece was made of and where is still today, the Church of St. Bevil in Ghent. Here, again, we see this altarpiece that, as you can see, is more than 11 feet high and 15 feet width. We see it open. Here is the altarpiece closed. Again, you have to imagine this different access that people at the time had to the altarpiece. So this, of course, is an artwork that could be described in detail, and it would require a good amount of time. But here, what I want to stress is that at the center we have God the Father, and on his right, the Virgin Mary, and on the left, St. John the Baptist. On the side of what is called the upper register of a polyptych are these singing and playing angels. At the end of the two wings of this upper register, we can see an incredible depiction of Adam and Eve. On the lower register at the center, on the contrary, we see a very, very complex, symbolically complex scene, the so-called Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. So here is how the polyptych appears today in Ghent. So I was saying that in the lower register, at the center, you have this depiction of the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. The lamb here on the altar, as you can see, on an altar, is a symbol of Christ and is a symbol of the crucifixion of Christ. And the people, the crowd around it, a crowd made of angels with the symbols of the passions, also is a crowd where you can recognize popes, you can recognize saints, you can recognize hermits, you can recognize merchant. It means that it's the whole world that is adoring Jesus Christ here under the form of a mystic lamb. As I told you, this tension between realism and the symbolism is one of the most characterizing aspects of 15th century Netherlandish arts. And here, for example, we have detail from the singing angels. And probably lots of you will be surprised in seeing how deep is Van Eyck's understanding of the different expression and feelings that characterize these people while they're singing. As you can see, you can perceive that some of them are very, very concentrated in what they're singing in order not to take the wrong tone. Other are more, on the contrary, let's say, immersed in the spiritual feeling, connected with the text of the song that they are, the religious song that they are singing. And of course, at the same time, look at how the dresses of this angel, the crowns of these angels, become the occasion for Van Eyck to depict the variety of the surfaces, of the material, of the clothes, and of the metals in which these jewels are made of. Once closed, the Ghent Altarpiece show an Annunciation here with the Virgin, the Holy Spirit, and the angel on the upper register, and on the lower register we have, on the contrary, a depiction of the patrons who commissioned it. And these patrons, is very interesting to remark, were not aristocrats, they were a merchant. And his name was Jodocus Vid and his wife Lisbeth. They were mentioned in Ghent, and also Jodocus was for 4 years, from 1426 to 1429, a mayor of the city of Ghent. And so you understand that the commission of such an incredible object also was part of a broader, let's say, social and political strategies of Jodocus Vid in order to, let's say, highlight his importance within the Ghent society. And again, if we come closer to the portrait of Jodocus Vid by Jan van Eyck, we see this incredible naturalistic characteristic of 15th century Netherlandish art. Portraits is a new genre that emerges in the Flanders of the 15th century. And here you see how Van Eyck, in painting the portrait of Jodocus, offered a very realistic rendition of his face, with the wrinkle on his forehead and this very, let's say, tensed mouth, and also very intense depiction of the hands praying. But if you want to know more and see more, especially, of the Ghent Altarpiece, I suggest you to visit this internet site where you can, I would say, travel through the surface of the paintings composing the Ghent Altarpiece, thanks to a very, very high quality resolutions images. Here, on the contrary, I would like to speak about how even such a big object like the Ghent Altarpiece somehow traveled the space through the centuries. From its very complexion in the first half of the 15th century, the Ghent Altarpiece was a very admired object. And here, for example, you can see a copy of the Adoration of the Mystic Lamp made in the second half of the 16th century for the King of Spain, Philip II. So basically, in a time where photography did not exist, copying an altarpiece was one of the few ways, together with having a print taken from it, that allowed it to have if not the original, a copy of it in your collection. And this is exactly what Philip II asked to Michel Coxey, a famous artist of the Netherlands of the second half of the 16th century. And this copy of the part of the paintings that consisted of the copy of the altarpiece are now in Berlin at the Bode Museum. And so it's very interesting while visiting the Bode Museum and after having studied in the class the Ghent Altarpiece to look at this copy by Michel Coxey. But as I was saying, the Ghent Altarpiece was very, very, very admired. And it means that during the century, it was taken away from its original location different times. He was sent to Paris at the beginning of the 19th century. It was Napoleon who decided to bring this altarpiece together with a number of other objects from all over Europe and especially Italy in order to create the gallery of painting of the new Louvre Museum. Then, after the fall of Napoleon, the altarpiece came back to Ghent, but it was soon after sold to a merchant that, at its turn, sold it to the King of Prussia. So for some decades during the 19th century, the Ghent Altarpiece was to be found in Berlin, exactly in the Gemälde Gallery, not in the place, of course, where we see the Gemälde Gallery is today, but in the Royal Palace in the center of Berlin. But, you know, history is very complex. And so in the second half of the 19th century, the King of Netherlands managed to have the Ghent Altarpiece back to Ghent. But later in the 20th century, again was the German who took it from Ghent, and was Hitler that, as part of his project of a new universal art museum in Linz, took the Ghent Altarpiece down from the altar in Ghent and brought it in the south of Germany and in Austria in particular. Actually, the US Army in the 1945, as you can see here in this photograph from the National Archives and Records Administration, the US Army found the paintings in the Altaussee mine. So it was a mine where these and other artwork were stored in order to preserve them from damages. And here you can recognize, you probably recognize, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamp that we have seen previously on our screen and also in the copy of Michel Coxey. So this example wanted to highlight how complex the story, the material story of an altarpiece like this one can be during the century, and how, from a certain point of view, it's false, this idea that we have in the museum as a quiet and silent place. Each of the objects that we find in the museum are somehow the heirs, let's say, of very complex historical events and transaction. Now I would like to move to another object, the last object that we will see together today in this lecture. Another altarpiece from the 15th century Netherlands. And As you can see, this is a very, very big also altarpiece that can be now found in Florence at the Galleria degli Uffizi. And well, again, this altarpiece arrived in Florence, this time at the very beginning of its history. It was made by Hugo van der Goes in the late 15th century, around 1476, for a Florentine merchant, Tommaso Portinari. Tommaso Portinari was the head of the Banco de' Medici, in Bruges, one of the most important Netherlandish towns of the 15th century. So basically, Tommaso Portinari, who is here depicted, as you can see, on the left wing of the triptych, and here on the right, you can see his wife and their sons. And Tommaso Portinari, as I was saying, commissioned this work to Hugo van der Goes in order to donate it to the Church of Sant'Egidio in Florence. So you have to imagine that this enormous altarpiece you can see here today, how it appears in the room of the Uffizi Gallery. This triptych, this altarpiece, traveled for months in the Atlantic and through the Mediterranean Sea in order to reach Florence. So this is what in my presentation at the beginning I called traveling artworks. But what is absolutely fascinating is, of course, try to understand how this artwork, once arrived in Florence, in this case, impacted on the local artistic scene of the time. But first, let's have a look to the subject of this wonderful triptych. As I told you, on the two wings, we can see the donors and saints. And at the center, on the contrary, we recognize immediately the episode of the Adoration of the Child. Here is Mary, here are angels praying around, here is St. John, and here are the shepherds that came soon after the birth of Christ. And here in this detail, you see how Van der Goes, like Van Eyck, managed to render the very, let's say, peculiar attitudes and expressions and feelings on the faces of these shepherds. Look at how these shepherds here on the back is trying to look at what is happening around him. And at the same time, as already we have seen in Van Eyck, Hugo van der Goes managed to render here some of the earliest still lifes of flowers in the history of European art. But as I was telling you, it's very interesting to look how local Florentine artists reacted to the arrival of Hugo van der Goes painting in Florence. And here we have one of these reactions. This is an altarpiece by Domenico Ghirlandaio, representing again the Adoration of the Shepherds. This is a painting dated 1485 that was made for the Church of Santa Trinita, for the Sassetti Chapel in the Church of Santa Trinita in Florence. Well, if you look carefully, especially here, the figure on the right, you see that Ghirlandaio took time in order to study and understand the naturalism of Hugo van der Goes' painting. And this comparison, I would say, between the painting by Ghirlandaio and the triptych by Hugo van der Goes is also very important in order to understand how also one of the most famous, let's say, subjects of the history of European art, that is to say, the Italian Renaissance, and more specifically, the Florentine Renaissance, didn't exist in isolation from what happened in the rest of Europe. Also, the Florentine Renaissance was characterized by a dialogue with other artistic and cultural tradition. And here we have seen a little glimpse of this dialogue through the case of the triptych by van der Goes, but other examples could have been brought here in order to explore this aspect. And of course, this is something that I will be glad to do together with you during one of our next FUBiS classes. And I would like to conclude this short lecture with this quotation by Edward Said, that in somehow goes exactly in the direction of this dialogue between cultural tradition that I mentioned all throughout this conversation. I quote from Said: "The history of all cultures is the history of their encounters, interactions, and borrowings." To continue to explore this interaction, I hope to see you soon in Berlin. And I thank you for your attention. And let's get in touch, as you can see in this last slide. Goodbye.